Part 3 of 21, June 3, 2014, Commonwealth Club Forum Series. Secrets of Treasure Island, Uncovering the Navy's Radioactive Legacy. I'm Carol Harvey, investigative reporter. I shot, edited, and uploaded this video to my YouTube channel, Carol Harvey SF. Panelist Stanford Professor George Moore describes radioactive sources that may have been disposed of in Treasure Island soil.
The U.S. Navy, and I assume other navies, used small markers on ships to mark what we call sound-powered phone outlets. On a Navy ship, the communications, when people are manning all their stations, are done with a headset which is actually doesn't require any electricity. So they're called sound-powered phones.
This is a sound-powered phone. A Navy lookout in the Pacific about 1944 with a sound-powered phone. A Navy Seaman uses a sound-powered phone aboard an aircraft carrier in 2015.
At night, when you go out on deck to plug in your sound-powered phone, you were not allowed to show any light. You couldn't. The light can be seen a long distance away. You don't want to tell people where you are. This is in the days before night vision devices, but the human eye is very sensitive to light at any distance. So there were these small buttons that marked each sound-powered phone location, and they were filled with a radioactive phosphor, radium-226 phosphor. Now those buttons were about, maybe the size of a 50-cent piece. They screwed on to a little threaded fitting, and those were quite common. A ship would have hundreds of those on various locations. On a gun mount, every person that plugged in had a place that was marked with one of these little buttons.
There are large and small gun mounts. A swivel gun mount like this relic once displayed on Treasure Island would have been too large for a radioactive button marker. But radioactive buttons could have lit these small modern gun mounts inside a Navy ship.
There was a lot of use of other uses of radium to mark various things, instruments, dials, things like that. Again, they were painted with a radium dial, much like watches were in the 20s and 30s. So it's very common.
When these pieces were dug from Treasure Island soil, they looked something like this.
Like the smoke detectors in your house, which many of them contain americium-241, a radioactive material, people aren't real sensitive to that.
A tiny amount of radioactive americium-241 dioxide, enough to power a modern-day smoke detector, has been placed inside this small radioactive button.
So some people probably would take these buttons off. They would be disposed of. At one point in time, during the 1970s, when I was going to graduate school at Berkeley, I was asked to come down and look at a gun mount that the Naval ROTC unit had because they had some of these buttons. Took them off, measured them, they were hot, took them up and disposed of them in waste, properly, in radioactive waste, as I was in the School of Nuclear Engineering. A lot of these apparently were just disposed of in maybe not so carefully. And I think these may be some of the sources that you're finding on the island as discrete sources. Radium-226 has a 1,600-year half-life. So those things that were produced during the Second World War have hardly decayed at all. The phosphor may have decreased, but the radioactive material is at pretty much the same level it was when it was put into the devices.
So that's news, actually, because that was an explanation I hadn't heard before, and that's been a pretty hot topic, pardon the pun on Treasure Island. What exactly are these things that are kind of ubiquitous in the soil there? George, can you sort of put what was going on back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s in context of why it's an issue or why it might be relevant now with respect to development sites like this, brownfields, can you maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you do and then bring the past and present together as far as sensibilities and activities of the Cold War period and what we're having to do about it now?
Well, there were a number of activities at Treasure Island. One of them has been mentioned. There was a damage control school where they taught people how to deal with radioactively contaminated ships.
These Navy men were exposed to radiation.
One of the things that they did there was from time to time they would spread short-lived radioactive material for people to actually set up in their suits, go in, work in an area, decontaminate, do that sort of thing.
The story goes that Navy instructors buried radioactive objects in Treasure Island soil in a kind of treasure hunt in which student sailors scanned the dirt with geiger counters to find radiological objects.
That's no longer there. The long-term activity that may be found there is primarily probably radium-226, which is, again, the 1600-year half-life. But it's doubtful that there's a lot of that. If there are small discrete sources, of course they need to be found, they need to be collected up and disposed of. They are not highly radioactive. I mean, these things were buttons that were, you would sit next to, and there were dials that you would read, and there were things like wristwatches that you would wear on your wrist. Modern day, we don't look at those as being a good use of radioactive material, but they're not highly dangerous. Yet you wouldn't want to walk around with a bunch of these buttons in your pocket. It's the smaller stuff. It's the stuff that might have been inadvertently disposed of or possibly disposed of under standards which allowed them to bury that sort of activity in shallow burial. There may have been some deposition like that on the island. I'm not personally knowledgeable of that.
Before this June 3, 2014 panel discussion, Navy documents revealed they had dug up 595 radioactive items, and Treasure Islanders, some children, had picked them up off the ground. In 2014, George Moore had no way of knowing that by 2020, the Navy would excavate about 1,300 radioactive objects from Treasure Island soil, and that as of 2021, 7 years later, the Navy continues to dig out radioactive foils hot enough to burn human skin.
So the Navy used a lot of different materials on the island. We think, or I think personally, for the most part, that the large sources were well cared for, they were licensed, they were swipe tested. This is a way of, these are seal sources, and periodically they would wipe them down and then check the wipes to see if there was anything that was leaking out of the source. Those should be well accounted for, and they should have good records of those.
Navy documents affirm Professor Moore's statements here to be true. However, in Smith and Mieszkowski's February 25, 2014 investigative report, Treasure Island Cleanup exposes Navy's mishandling of its nuclear past, the reporters had already raised doubts, writing that in 1984 and 1986, officials from the Navy's Radiological Affairs Support Office, RASO, inspected Treasure Island's atomic warfare schools. RASO chastised island officials for failing to follow radiation safety protocols by neglecting routine monitoring for leakage from sealed radiation check sources containing plutonium and cesium. Roy H. Smith reported that Treasure Island schools were so dysfunctional that they risked putting students in harm's way, leaving the base's trove of radioactive material insecure. Roy Smith cautioned that Navy officials at the school didn't know how to use their instruments and demonstrated a need for immediate remedial training. However, Professor Moore was correct about Building 233. In 1950, a radium-226 spill occurred in a lab in Building 233. Students and employees tracked radiation out of the building to their cars parked across the street on Avenue M, driving the radiation across the bridge to San Francisco and beyond.
My father was actually stationed on the island as well. He was a Navy officer. He was there when they had the radium spill in 1950, which shows up in a lot of the documentation. At one of the schools, they actually did have radium that was not part of a seal source, and they had a spill, there was contamination, and they had to decontaminate both people and equipment and even privately owned vehicles, which caused quite a bit of concern because insurance companies said, we're not going to pay you for your car that's now radioactively contaminated. And so people said, well, who's going to pay? It was quite an issue for a time.
This huge radiation spill produced massive consequences. Decontamination of both people and materials took over a year. Guards were posted around Building 233. There was too much radioactive material for the Navy to dispose of safely, so they loaded barrels with this stuff, rolled the barrels onto the radioactive U.S.S Independence, and sunk the ship off the Farallone Islands, where the radioactive ship remains deep on the ocean floor today.